Hello. This set of video lectures are going to cover the Chapter 3, formerly Chapter 2, of ICD-10 PCS coding. We're going to cover its use, its history, and give you some very important information about ICD-10 PCS. Okay. As mentioned, this is the introduction to ICD-10 PCS. In this edition of the book, it's a little bit more extensive, which I think you'll find helpful. We're going to talk about the basic concepts of ICD-10 PCS. We'll cover all the procedures. Again, this is for hospital-based procedures only, which we'll be talking more about. It has a little bit of a different feel than ICD-10-CM, the diagnosis coding, or CPT, and that's normal. With coding, you don't need to necessarily memorize the codes. It's important to understand how the system is built and how to find the codes as opposed to rote memorization. So by the end of this chapter, you'll have a solid understanding of the basic concepts, and later we'll apply these same concepts to specific body systems. So basically, that's what we have in store for you. And again, what is ICD-10 PCS? Well, similar to ICD-10 CM, it's procedure coding system. It's the 10th revision and it's for hospital or inpatient, as we say, procedures only. It was developed under contract from CMS by 3M Health Information Systems. Now, of course, we know 3M is Solventum. So it is the designated coding system for procedure codes for all inpatient hospital procedures. So what does it look like? It's a multi-axle 7-character code. Every character has a specific meaning. There's no generic procedure codes. PCS was designed so every substantially different procedure has its own unique code. This is different than ICD-9, which ICD-9 just had pacemaker implant. That was it. Now you go into all these other finer points of the approach, the root operation, things that we'll get into. It was initially released in 1998. It last was updated in October of 2025. So that's why we always ask you to get the current coding books. Some attributes that make it unique is its completeness. Every procedure can be coded. It's expandable. New procedures fit logically into place. Now we have surgical robotic procedures, and there's a way to get these incorporated. It's multi-axial, so each character stands alone, and it uses standardized terminology. So definitions matter. So you can't the important thing is that you have to understand and be able to visualize what's going on with each hospital procedure. And again, just a couple, or actually four important reminders. PCS codes never include the diagnosis or the reason for the procedure. It only includes what was done. So when we talk about diagnosis coding, we're talking about the why for the hospitalization, the why for the procedure in this case, right? Procedure codes only code what was done. The system also minimizes vague codes like not otherwise specified or other, and it allows every procedure to be coded without defaulting to unspecified codes. And of course, the system will allow for all procedures to be coded within the ICD-10 PCS code system. And again, every PCS code has 7 characters, and each character answers a specific question, right? And each character has a specific value, if you will, that has meaning. And we'll take a look at that in just a little bit. And the questions that it asks are, what section are we in? What body system are we working on? What is the objective of the procedure? In other words, the root operation, right? And then what body part? How did the provider get there? What was the approach? Was a device left in place? And is there a qualifier that gives additional detail? Every character has 1 to 34 values, and a value is a number 0 through 9, or it could be a letter, A through H, J through N, or P through Z. The alphabetic letters, interestingly enough, of O and I are not used. And the reason for this is that they're not confused with the number 0 or the number 1. And the code structure we've covered, and we have to use a specific value for each of these 7 characters. And we talk about the section, the body system, the root operation, the body part, the approach, the device, and the qualifier. And again, this way we can have very specific codes and get down to a very granular level of detail about these. And again, we've seen this or alluded to it. The first character is the section, right? Second, the body system. Third, the root operation, if you will. The body part, the approach, the device, and the qualifier. So with ICD-10 PCS, it uses both an alphabetic index and tables, but the table is where the actual code is built. The index guides you in the right direction, usually by the root operation. Once you're in the table, characters 4 through 7 must come from the same row, right? So you can't mix and match and be all over the place. And we'll see some illustrations of this in a little bit. Each table will identify the first 3 characters of the code, and the table is used to obtain the complete code by specifying the last 4 characters. And these are the characters that have to be from the same row. So we're talking specifically about characters 4, 5, 6, and 7. So again, how do we do this? Well, if for this example, if you could take your ICD-10 PCS codebook, and we're going to look at appendectomy. We have an open appendectomy. So we go to the alphabetic index and we look up appendectomy. And we'll see 2 entries, excision and resection. And for this, you need to know the definitions of what these are. An appendectomy is a resection, and that means that it's the removal of an entire body part, in this case, the appendix, right? So again, we're going to access and follow along in your code book. So you get this. This is 0DT resection appendix. And then we'll see 4 columns that appear that are appropriate with this. 4th character is the body part, in this case, appendix. 5th character is the approach. In this case, it's open, and we'll get into what these things mean. 6th character is the device used, no device, meaning no device is left behind. And the 7th character is a qualifier, and there is no qualifier in this case. So again, this is where the definitions matter. You need to know what's open in terms of the approach. You need to know that an appendectomy is a resection, and you need to understand the section, right? In this case, if you think about it, the first character, which is a section, is 0, right? So that's where we're going to go. And you'll be using this section a lot. And the body system defines the body system that is the anatomical region, right? So in this case, it's D. And then the root operation, we already covered that. It's a resection. Fourth character is the body part. And follow along in your code book with this. Fifth is the approach. In this case, it's open. And the device, there may or may not be a device left in place at the end of a procedure. And then a qualifier. What a qualifier is an additional attribute of a procedure. Like you can have stents that are placed in a coronary artery that release medication and so on. ICD-10 PCS has 16 sections, and the sections are numbered 0 through 9, letters B through D, F through H, and X. And with 16 sections are within the three main sections of medical and surgical related section, and ancillary section. Within the medical surgical section, which has the majority of the procedures performed in an inpatient setting, the first character will always be a 0. The second section, medical and surgical related section, includes procedures such as obstetrics, placement, administration, measurement, monitoring, extracorporeal assistance, performance, extracorporeal therapies, osteopathic, other procedures, and chiropractic. All of these procedures will begin with the section value of 1 through 9. And third section is the ancillary section. It includes procedures such as imaging, nuclear medicine, radiation oncology, physical rehabilitation, audiology, mental health and substance abuse, and new technology. All procedures begin with the section value of B through D, F through H, or X. Okay, I hope you found that useful. We're going to continue on with our introduction to ICD-10 PCS and watch to learn more about other things that are important with PCS codes in the hospital setting. That's all I have for you. Thanks for watching. Bye now.